And I thank you all for inviting me to join you this morning. I feel somewhat in over my head in the company of so many extraordinary public servants. And by that, I mean so many of you who are serving the interests of our global commons with your wisdom, experience, expertise, passion, and commitment for a future with promise for all. Your theme, healthy farming, healthy food, healthy future, resonates especially with me, given my long experience living and working in the developing world and in conflict-affected communities. I am confident that the many experts who will share their insights during today's sessions will contribute to the much-needed dialogue on these important issues. In turn, I would like to share some perspectives from my experiences as a public servant over the past 40 years, working in different capacities throughout the world, including through our foundation's programs to promote Middle East sustainable development models, human rights, cross-cultural understanding, and peace. Looking back on the world's many achievements during those 4 decades, and also looking at the agenda of your gathering here today, highlights to me the paradox of development with disparity that may be the central challenge of our day, and also of the decades ahead. In my work with the critical challenges of the displaced, the missing, the marginalized, those suffering crushing poverty, I have seen the seeds of perpetual instability and conflict, but where real investment has been made in sustainable human security, in education and training, youth and women's leadership, economic and political opportunity, I have seen the previously excluded flourish as agents of change, capable of transforming not only their own communities, but also national mindsets to foster remarkable changes in society. The world, including much of the Middle East, has made spectacular progress in improving the well-being of billions of individuals. And since my Rachel Carson-inspired generation launched the first Earth Day in 1970, we have seen encouraging, burgeoning environmental awareness and action throughout the world. Yet many societies today remain plagued by stubborn, unmet, basic human needs, and increasing examples of chronic poverty and marginalization that have become hereditary in many cases, passed on from generation to generation in pockets of vulnerable and often invisible people. Approximately 800 million people still live in extreme poverty, the overwhelming majority living in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And as probably many of you know, as much as 80% of the poor live in rural areas and rely on agriculture to sustain their families and livelihoods. Income inequality within nations and between wealthy and poorer countries continues to grow, resulting in a small percentage of people and nations controlling the vast majority of our economic and natural resources. And while current global food production should be adequate to meet human nutritional needs, problems with distribution mean that 1 in 9 people are malnourished. These challenges are significant in and of themselves, but as we all know, are further exacerbated by the effects of climate change and agricultural practices. Yanis has already mentioned the other contributing factors. Despite some notable successes and over 500 international agreements, our global community has made very uneven progress in achieving global environmental goals and improving the state of our environment. He also mentioned fossil fuels increasing greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere at the same time that global deforestation, 88% of which is caused by agriculture, is removing a natural mechanism to sequester carbon. In addition, the pernicious export of industrial countries industrialized countries ban pesticides to developing countries, an issue that shocked me when I first arrived in Jordan in the mid-1970s, is damaging ecosystems and having harmful effects on the health of inland and coastal communities. And of course, a third of our countries are suffering moderate to high water stress in the world, already a source of conflict within and among nations. Within this context, we have to ask ourselves, how quickly can we, and we must, transition to resource-efficient and environmentally benign methods of food production and distribution? And while the UN Sustainable Development Goals provide a long-term framework for action, I believe that we must bring urgency to our actions today. Because of the interconnected nature of climate change and poor resource management crises with food security, as a result, overall human security are having profound international consequences right now. While many countries and regions now struggle with unprecedented dislocation of millions of people due to conflict and social upheaval, underlying but too often overlooked causes are water resources mismanagement and climate change. The civil war in Syria, the Darfur conflict in Sudan, conditions in Yemen and Somalia are among the most disturbing examples of how natural resource management by governments leading to food insecurity, internal migrations, and military conflicts, all of which have been cruelly exacerbated by droughts. In 2009, for example, several 100,000 Syrians abandoned their homes, farms, and rangelands in northeastern Syria due to drought because they could no longer make a living. Their migration to urban centers in a desperate search for economic opportunity contributed to the pressures which led to the outbreak of conflict in 2011. And the long-term global projections for migration are shocking, with the potential for hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people needing to migrate for food, shelter, and economic opportunity. Feeding the global population will require more arable land as it increases, even as rising seas consume fertile coastal zones and river deltas, driving people again to seek new places to live. By 2060, about 1.4 billion people could be climate change refugees, which further reinforces the need for all countries to make the transition to renewable forms of energy in order to meet the carbon reduction targets of the Paris Climate Accord. Nowhere has greater vulnerability than Africa. The combined effects of desertification, soil degradation, coastal erosion, drought, and intense agriculture will create hardships for farmers, increase food insecurity, rural to urban migration, and the potential for instability and conflict. As I've seen with our work with Iraqi and Syrian refugees in Jordan, this migration places additional strains on host communities as migrants disappear into underserved urban pockets, often competing with resentful citizens for scarce resources. The implications of such mass suffering and displacement are dire, not only today for those immediately affected, but for coming generations everywhere, in the loss of educated, productive human potential that is required to rebuild nations or conflict regions, and also in the dangerous, unprecedented polarization and other potential drivers of radicalization and future violence from the loss of hope and confidence in the future. That is why your focus on food, agriculture, environmental protection, and a sustainable, healthy future is not just one technical sector of development policies today. It is central to how we address the challenges we face, given the links to virtually every dimension of society, economy, human welfare, and peace and security. Based on my work over the last 40 years, I humbly reiterate that in order for us to be successful, we must more aggressively draw on the knowledge and untapped capabilities of communities of men and women whom we have largely marginalized. The women, girls, youth, rural communities, and the urban poor who remain outside our world's mainstreams, whether developmental, economic, technological, and political. I suggest that we should be focusing more attention on several critical and interconnected dimensions to accelerate the solutions we all seek. Capacity building within local communities, inclusive and integrated decision-making at the local, national, and international levels, and private sector commitment to accelerate adoption of already available sustainable crop production solutions universally. When thinking about capacity building in the developing world, I begin with women and youth. And I know this is a conference on agriculture, but we've all heard the phrase, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. In my experience, the saying should be, teach a woman to fish or to farm, and everyone eats. And there is a direct linkage between the capacity of our world to feed itself and the ability of rural women to participate fully in the economic, social, and political life of their communities. If we aspire to feed the entire human family at a global level, we should keep in mind who produces and provides food at the community level in most societies: rural women. They are the farmers, the shepherds, and gardeners of the South. They know where to get clean water and how to use it wisely. They know how to weed fields, control pests, and manage rangelands, for they store the cumulative wisdom and knowledge of generations past in so many cases. In my country, as in many other societies, the rural woman also remains the anchor of her family and in many ways of her community. In the early 1980s, I began a series of experiments to adapt to our region a WHO and Save the Children initiatives that had been effective in other parts of the world. We introduced a comprehensive, integrative approach to development in the region, with a special emphasis on the critical role played by women in achieving sustainable progress. These initiatives help transform development thinking in our country and gradually throughout the region away from purely traditional charity-oriented social welfare, in which poor women especially were mainly passive recipients, toward an emphasis on developing the national and regional economic potential of women and the poor. We were able to credibly demonstrate that with the education, training, income generation opportunities, and credit, women meet their children's nutritional needs, teach them good health, environmental practices, ensure their education, and improve the family's overall quality of life. But this in turn, and this is why it's so important, promotes local and national stability and prosperity by reducing poverty and hunger and imported products, improving health and education, and combating desperation and the radicalization I mentioned earlier, in no small part because women raise daughters and sons with access to horizons of gender, social, political, and economic possibility. As a result of this laser focus on women, our foundation rapidly became a source of best practice models, training, and capacity building in over 20 countries throughout Western Asia. The world can produce more food in the short term through biotechnologies, crop diversification and rotation, integrated pest management, et cetera, et cetera. But in the long term, these achievements, if not accompanied by equitable and balanced development, will remain vulnerable to the wider threats of social turbulence and political instability, especially in agrarian societies, where the basic production unit, the family, is under economic, environmental, and political pressure. And at the same time, we must empower our youth. A According to 1/3 of the world's youth live in countries that have suffered a violent conflict. Almost 43% of the global youth labor force is either unemployed or working, but living in poverty. And many are underserved by their political systems. At least 60% of the Arab world is under 30 and facing the highest unemployment rate in the world. This is why the King Hussein Foundation has been acting as a force for young people from underserved communities in education, economic empowerment, and entrepreneurship, as well as community service and cross-cultural understanding. And in providing opportunities for these young people to open their minds to debate, just much as you are doing here, all from many different perspectives, one of the most gratifying results has been that in their choices for community service and in their student independent projects, a vast number of them are addressing sustainable development challenges, and a good number of those have won international awards. Witnessing these students grow and succeed has been my most rewarding work in the foundation. I would encourage all of you, through the means that you have, to find opportunities to support, mentor, and train this next generation, because in the decades to come, we will increasingly rely upon them, and they are ready and waiting. As we empower youth and women, we need to provide them with a seat at the table. And this forum, I think, brilliantly exemplifies an alternative to traditional top-down, siloed, exclusive approaches to decision-making. This forum's more inclusive, participatory, and I think I can say gender-sensitive development approach, bringing all stakeholders to the table to listen, inspire, and brainstorm together is the only way, I think, to reverse the destructive cycle of food insecurity. And that to break that cycle, we have to emphasize a more equitable distribution of development benefits. I'm running out of time, but I do want to place a little emphasis on the importance, again, of engaging local farmers and families, especially women, in many parts of the world, because smallholder farms contribute 50% of global agriculture production. In Africa, nearly 90%. And women farmers are the ones producing 60 to 80% of the food in most developing countries. Our own experience in Jordan has highlighted the critical impact of open, inclusive, integrative development approaches in both large-scale national development projects and at the village scale. And we learned by trial and error that sustainable development at the individual, community, or national levels succeeded most often when local residents were able to voice their concerns and aspirations, as well as to offer practical suggestions based on their immense knowledge of local conditions. As I mentioned earlier, some of this is generations old, and safeguarding this invaluable generational wisdom is immensely important for us all. There's a role here also for those of you in the private sector. I know that you are continuously researching and commercializing crop solutions that are increasingly resource efficient, non-toxic, and enhance productivity. But we need more from you. The private sector brings an expertise and dynamism that is unmatched. We need greater urgency in the universal adaptation of these solutions to ensure that all rural farmers have access to these products. You know how to manage supply chains and the distributions of your products to market. We need your help to fix the distribution systems that plague much of the developing world. It's in our collective self-interest to maintain stability, restore viability to vulnerable communities. So I would hope that in the course of your meetings today and the work that you undertake in your various spheres of focus and influence, what can you do to accelerate multi-sector investment in the empowerment and employment of women and youth in your companies or your countries? And second, what can we do better to incorporate the insights, wisdom, and expertise of these communities in the planning and implementation of efforts to advance food security? And how can we all more effectively advocate with government leaders to prioritize sustainable development at the human, economic, agricultural, and environmental levels? It must be a team effort. It will take all of us working together, putting our heads together, and this FAA, and one of the reasons I'm so privileged to be here, is such a marvelous example of the value of that. And then lastly, given that per capita income increases and urbanization and changed diets means that agriculture's relative contribution to national employment and economic growth will increase significantly in the near future, what can the private sector do to scale the transfer of knowledge and access to available and universally accepted products throughout the world, especially in the most vulnerable communities? I know that many of you here today are leaders who have a voice and influence in your respective countries and regions. With all of the challenges we face to provide comprehensive food security for billions, it is clear that we will be dependent upon all of you to help us make the transition to a more sustainably resilient, healthy, and peaceful future. This, I believe, is a seed whose harvest will be enjoyed for tens of generations to come. Thank you very much. I am 9 seconds ahead of time.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Thank you.
I'm savoring that extra 9 seconds. On your Twitter profile, it describes you as an idealistic global citizen. Give us an example of your idealism.
Well, it may not have been entirely evident in my remarks because, of course, I was talking about the uneven progress and emphasized more the challenges that remain to us. But in all my work and in my fundamental faith in man, faith in one's ability to make a difference, and that everyone that we reach out to and connect with, much as you're doing here in this conference, or I don't think you'd be here, and many of you coming back year after year after year. I think we all believe that with our best efforts, we can together mobilize a more critical mass, more successful critical mass of people who can help to ensure that our future is more peaceful because it is more sustainable, our life on this planet, and our relations with one another can be a legacy we pass on to future generations with hope and possibility. So everything I do.
Everything you do. All right, so I'm looking at your foundation, and part of your agenda is conservation, really caring about the environment, and you've been doing this for a long time. What spurred this interest in conservation?
As I mentioned, being one of a Rachel Carson-inspired generation, we grew up in middle school, I guess, reading Rachel Carson, and then the first Earth Day in the United States really galvanized many in my generation to begin to think about our human impact on the natural environment. When I arrived in Jordan was caught up in the beauty and really seduced by an extraordinary and both natural environment and historical and archaeological, and once married, became more aware of the challenges that we faced there. It seemed to be, and it became one of my first focuses of attention. For example, Jordan, recognizing, and perhaps because of our limited resources, recognized the challenges that were being faced by, for example, disappearing wild species and birds. My husband was a hunter. He loved to hunt, but a group of hunters got together with him and started the first conservation organization in the region. And our history with that organization, and also with the efforts I've undertaken and others in local communities, actually has been a way of inspiring the rest of the region, and also through our efforts helping to develop the capacity in other countries in the region with far greater resources, but a lack of understanding and knowledge. So we developed the first national environment strategy for the country with the help of IUCN and others, and the first national environment law. And we continue to try, in spite of all the pressures upon our economy and others, to keep that a priority in terms of government planning. But it is a constant challenge in the developing world.
I'm just going to name check a couple of the organizations that you've been related to. The Conservation International, BirdLife International, International Union for Conservation of Nature, Jordan's Royal Society for Conservation of Nature. I can see why people would want you to be involved, but what do you get out of it?
Oh, just as last night I had the immense privilege of sitting together with some of the speakers for this forum, and what I receive from my work with IUCN or any of these other organizations you mentioned is an ability to listen and learn from experts in fields that all of which are important to the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish, what you're trying to accomplish here, which is what we need to accomplish in every corner of the world. So it's always an immense privilege. I always feel like a student. I felt very humble last night listening to the people you're going to be listening to in this forum. And if there's some small contribution that I can make in Jordan or in our region or in any other part of the world by inspiring women or helping to highlight the importance of their role and highlight the importance that Islam, the religion of our region, places on conservation. In fact, the first conservation protected areas were probably those mandated in Islam through its teachings, setting aside areas to be protected for wildlife and emphasizing the importance that human beings have to protect the natural world.
Not many people in this audience will know that you are a very, very small-scale farmer. Very small scale. How small scale?
Well, again, I was sitting at a table last night and with a number of experts, farmers from Europe and international conservation experts and private sector representatives of companies that are very much involved in what we're talking about here. And I had to begin by saying that I felt a bit, as I said today, out of my depth, because at best I could be described as a nano farmer, somebody who knows how to pot plants, somebody who has a herb garden. My children, inspired by my taking them from very young ages out to plant trees, which is most of Jordan's forests were deforested during the Ottoman Empire as they built railroad tracks around. So annually and more often than that, we would plant trees in the country. We have at home some greenhouses and a solar plant and organic farming at a very small scale still, but nonetheless, they are turning into the farmers that I always hoped I might become.
Our theme, healthy farming, healthy food, healthy future. Let's focus on the healthy food. What did you have for breakfast?
Every morning, no matter where I am, I have a breakfast that is a combination of several powders that provide protein, vitamins, minerals, and various other ingredients that create a sort of whole, healthy start for the day. The reason I call it a protein drink is because I actually live essentially on a plant-based diet and have for a very long time. And so that extra protein added to the grains and nuts and other foods that I eat is a very important start to the day.
So you are sort of a vegan, What does your daughter describe you as?
Okay. Now, Femi's asking me this because I confessed last night that my daughter, who could be described, and these are words she used, as a militant vegan, she's also very much involved in animal protection, and so it's all bound up with that lifelong passion of hers. It is immensely irritated with me every time I try to explain when people ask about my diet that I'm essentially vegan. And she just turns purple in the face because it's a lifestyle she maintains. And because she also knows that I say essentially because I do love a good pizza. I do like a good mac and cheese. But 99% of the time, I am living on a plant-based diet. And that's a term she would heartily approve of.
What you bring to this conversation is a view from the Middle East and also a view from the West. But as we're getting started in our conversation today, that view from the MENA region, the Middle East region, what do you want us to remember when we're talking about healthy farming, healthy food, healthy future, from the Middle East looking out?
Well, as I was trying to say in my remarks, it's vitally important. I mentioned that we need to make a team effort, that the public sector, private sector, non-governmental organizations, and locals, farmers, and others involved in food in particular, production in particular, are talking and listening to one another in order to resolve the fact that we are a region that actually is defying the international trend by increasing chronic malnourishment. At the same time, we are a region that has the highest rates of obesity and wheat imports. And the most important factor, we are a region that is the highest in income inequality in the world. So, coming from my region, these are all bound up in the work that we need to do and that many of us are trying to do to promote healthier lifestyle that is not just importing the worst of, if you'll excuse me, Western lifestyles, or I could say, because I grew up there, American fast food culture. But that is what is happening in so many regions of the world as Western societies begin to discuss more, listen more, learn more, and adapt their lifestyles to more and more people, I like to think, this is where I'm idealistic, to a more healthy lifestyle. In the regions, probably, I don't know about Africa as well, but I do know in Asia and I do know in the Middle East, we are suffering in the worst possible way from unhealthy lifestyles. But more importantly, it's that inequitable distribution of income that is the danger point. That is where we all need to advocate with governments to recognize that that is not in anyone's interest, as the Syrian situation points out to us and so many others around the world. And that non-governmental organizations have to have a seat at the table with the policymakers. There has to be a more healthy dynamic there, and those who represent local communities and their interests and concerns. So that, I think, is something that you all can contribute to in different ways. As I mentioned, the private sector has a role to play, and if you want a business model that's going to be sustainable into the future, you need to ensure that people are going to be wanting your products because they're living in areas where they can grow food, where they can where they can continue to interact with you. And the same thing with non-governmental organizations. We need you advocating with governments and the private sector. You understand what is needed. And those of you who represent governments here, we're counting on you to help us mainstream the ideas and mission of this organization so that it becomes better accepted everywhere.
Your Majesty, I'm thinking about your grandbabies, your grandkids. So in a sentence, for the healthy future, what is the world that you want to leave for your grandkids like?
Okay, I would very much like to leave them a world that will benefit from the kind of dialogue and initiatives that so many of you here represent.
Nicely done. And a shameless bid for applause. Your Majesty, Queen Noor Al Hussein of Jordan, thank you for joining us. I will walk you to the door.
Thank you very much.